So, welcome to this University of York Management School Masterclass. It's one of our Equality Matters series. Delighted to have Cynthia Davis here from Bain Recruitment Limited, and she is going to talk on the very topical subject of diversity and inclusion in the age of COVID-19. So Cynthia, I'm going to keep quiet. I'm going to keep out your way, and it's over to you. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled to be here. And yeah, I'm not sure what's happened to my slides. They seem to have disappeared. But whilst they're coming back on, I will just introduce myself and say that I'm Cynthia Davis, and I'm the chief exec of an organization called Bain Recruitment, and also the co-founder of an organization called diversifying.io. I've been working in the diversity and inclusion space for quite a long time now, and I think it's something that's becoming more of a talking point and conversation at the moment. I think given everything that's happened over the summer, it's made diversity and inclusion come to the forefront of a lot of people's minds, whether that's from organizations or as individuals, where we've all been looking at ourselves a little bit and thinking, you know, we really should be addressing this, and we really should be looking at how we can make that better. But obviously COVID thrown in has kind of created almost this storm of getting the agenda kind of moving a lot more quickly than maybe it has for a very long time, and has got people talking a lot more around what they should be doing around diversity and inclusion and how really they can make the world better for everybody. So just to give you a little bit of, if we can go to the next slide, please, Peter. So just a little intro into myself. Obviously, I'm not going to read all that, but as I mentioned, I've also been working within the diversity and inclusion space for quite some time, and working within recruitment for just over 20 years. So I have seen some of the challenges and barriers that exist for a lot of especially from a candidate perspective, but also from organizations that are trying to reach and engage with a much more diverse talent pool. And really today isn't to dissect from a recruitment perspective, but just to really look at the window of opportunity that we now have to address some of the inequalities that have been highlighted, or there's been a massive spotlight on during this COVID period in a lot more detail. So that's what I will be focusing on during my conversation. And we'll move to the next slide. So yes, just a little bit about the organizations that I run. So one, which is Bain Recruitment, which is a diversity and inclusion consultancy firm that works with organizations that are looking to reach and engage with a much more diverse talent pool. That's across all protected characteristics. For us, we're believing in creating equal opportunities for everybody, irrelevant of what background people come from. So whether that's from an ethnicity point of view, gender, LGBTQ+, disability, it's about making sure that everyone has equal access to opportunities. But we also have a diversity career platform where organizations can really talk about the journey that they're going on around D&I, and really showcase around things like their culture and the initiatives that they have within the organizations. But alongside that, promote opportunities and create a much more fairer access for everyone to have opportunity to apply for jobs in a much more different kind of way, knowing exactly the type of organizations and cultures that they have. So to lead on to today's topic, and I'm hoping that the slides behave because they seem to be misbehaving, but we'll move on to that. So if we were to think about pre-COVID in terms of where we were, you know, and if you're anything like me, I was somebody that was getting on the tube every single day, going into work, and it was probably a scene like this where we were all packed on a train station trying to squeeze into the last carriage that there was. But our lives were hectic. Our lives were very busy. We were rushing from one thing to the next, really didn't mind who we stood next to, who we were squashed next to. You know, it was a very, very different world. And sometimes looking at this kind of picture, I kind of, you know, kind of think, God, what kind of world was that? It seems like a completely alien to me, given the fact I haven't actually been on a train for almost a year now. But our world has changed, and I kind of think the way that we were as individuals, or how we ran our lives. We sometimes didn't have enough time to spend with our families. Some of us never made it home for dinner every night. You were lucky if you actually got home, in time to actually sit down and have a meal as a family. For staff that wanted to work flexibly, I remember having candidates that said, "Oh, I would like to have a job that allows me to work flexibly." And a lot of organizations say, "No, you've got to be in the office 9 till 5 because that is the way that to get productivity." And that was just the norm back then. No one really thought any differently, and working from home, things like furlough were never heard of. And if we flip to the next slide, Peter, I tried to kind of really look at in terms of how as a society we were living. It was very fast paced, and I think there was no time to really slow down and think about society and some of the inequalities that existed within our societies, because we were also busy getting on with life, getting on with things that we had to do. And then this pandemic kind of struck, and it shook us all to our core. And there was a lot of uncertainty that came out. But as we all started to get our heads of this new world that we were forced to live in, a lot of things started to become very clear around the society that we lived in. The lack of family time, was something that was quite prevalent. Things like the word furlough, all of a sudden everyone started talking about furlough. I'd never really heard of that word furlough, didn't even know what it meant. I remember having to Google it when, the government announced that they were introducing the furlough scheme, and, having to look at what does that mean from a business perspective? What does that mean for employees? And really our world as we know it started to change, and the way that we interacted with each other started to change. I remember trying to teach my parents to Zoom, and Zoom was obviously quite a newer concept for all of us, and they'd never heard of it. And I was like, well, that's the only way we're now going to be able to communicate, and having to get people that had never been used to technology to suddenly move into a new way of communicating, or new way of connecting with each other. And all those organizations that had thought it was impossible for anyone to work productively, from home, unless, all of a sudden had no other choice but to move everybody onto a remote way of working and moving everything online. So I think quickly our world changed. It changed in so many ways that I think a lot of us were not quite prepared for. And that had a lot of impact in terms of us as individuals, but us as a society. And again, things like, poverty were all of a sudden, people were talking about how people are going to live, how people are going to survive. People had to make decisions between, losing the livelihoods, or having heating, being able to afford heating, or feeding their children. These are conversations that a few months before we probably never quite thought of, or even thought of our neighbors in that sort of respect, in terms of how they were living. So quickly as a society we had to adapt. And if we move on to the next onto the next slide, our lives were put on hold. I think, it's the first time that every single day I made sure I watched the news. I was probably somebody that never really watched the news, but we all started living in a different way, where the daily briefings became part of our lives to find out what was going on in this world, what was going to be affecting us today, and how were we going to be able to manage to live, really, because none of us really knew what was going on. Employers were worried about their staff were worried about whether they had a job or not. So the way of living massively changed. And as I said, I don't think anyone was really prepared. But as we slowly started to adjust to a new way of living, some of the inequalities within our society started to surface. And if I move onto the next slide, I think for me, the pivotal moment came when we witnessed the events of the summer. We all watched something that was horrific in front of our eyes, which is the death of George Floyd. I think that shook the world to its core. And I think had that happened at a time where our lives hadn't slowed down to the pace that it had, or we weren't interacting in the way that we were through technology, it might have just been another moment that might have passed us by. But it made us all stand still and take a moment to finally realize the challenges and inequalities that still existed in our society. It made us witness firsthand some of the injustices and some of the systemic injustices that still exist in our society, from the way people were treated, the way people were treated in organizations, the way people were treated in society, access to things like healthcare. All these inequalities started to surface in a way that, made us stand still and think, why had we not taken or put attention to this? And there were people that obviously been focusing on some of these inequalities, but I think it was now elevated to a level that we couldn't run away from it. And you had the movement, the BLM movement, which was very vocal in the summer. And if we can move to the next slide, Peter. It really did, capture, the sentiment of how people were feeling. And there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of, the system had failed people. And it wasn't just from a race perspective. I think it made us as a society stand up and think, well, how have I not played a part in driving some of this change, or how have I not seen some of these inequalities that have existed? I look at things like from a work environment, people started to stand up and voice out their the inequalities that existed within a work environment, how they'd been treated, around some of the microaggressions that went on, around the lack of progression, around the lack of equal opportunities within organizations. And for the first time, people were brave to really call out some of these barriers and inequalities that existed. And, we saw organizations quickly jump onto trying to come out, and the black square started turning up, how people were saying, no, we're not a racist organization, we're anti-racist, and everybody wanted to vocalize how they were feeling. And it was a really difficult time and quite a traumatic time for a lot of people, because there were things that people had to relive that they maybe suppressed because the environment that they were in did not allow them to, talk about some of the inequalities and injustices that they were experiencing. And I think it was a moment in time that really changed us as a society. We came together in some ways. We stood up for each other. We stood up for those that we felt didn't have a voice. And I remember the marches and the protests, and everybody of all races were on the streets, marching together and calling out some of these injustices, because everybody wanted that change to finally happen. We had a moment in time where we could all play a part in driving that change. And I think because of the period that we were in lockdown, we all were able to see that, be part of that, engage with that, and again, learn from that. And I think it was the first time that people reached out to maybe their colleagues from different backgrounds to try and understand around their lived experiences, that people started reading literature around, from Black literature, or try to educate themselves around different backgrounds and different kind of communities. And it was a time where we really thought, if we do not use this time to educate ourselves, we will never get this moment in time for us to move forward as a society. And if we can move to the next slide, please, Peter. I think some of the key learnings from that was, it allowed us to really take that time to digest some of the information that we were seeing. And, it was constantly on the news. And this wasn't something that was just, within the US this was worldwide. And it just showed how far the inequalities went. This was a global and kind of issue where, we looked around things like intersectionality, around things like ethnicity, nationality, income, job security, access to things like healthcare. All those things came to the forefront, and were really, really, a spotlight was shown on all those areas. And I think it forced us and forced the government and forced organizations to finally act. And whether that act was in the right kind of way, there were others that, it was a knee-jerk reaction that we have to do something, we have to show that we're doing something. Dialogue around D&I was prioritized, and people started releasing statements. We saw statements from some of the the top organizations coming out and saying, we stand against racism. We're an anti-racist organization. We're going to be delivering training. And I think everybody was very vocal about what they were doing. And it felt like finally the moment had come that we all were going to address some of these inequalities. And it felt like there was a shift, there was a movement. You were living through a change that we'd all longed for such a long time, and that change was finally coming. And I remember having conversations with people that I never thought I'd have conversations with around race, because at the time the race was something that people shied away from because they didn't want to say the wrong thing, they didn't want to offend anybody, or they didn't want to ask the wrong kind of questions. And people who had been afraid to kind of learn or to call out bad behavior suddenly felt, I have to be an ally, I have to stand up, I have to call these kind of bad behaviors out. So for some of the good that was happening, there was also the negative side where, we started seeing people being trolled and being targeted on things like social media, again for standing up. And there was two sides of that came out of it. And for all those people that were in it together, there were also people that were against and rearing some of those kind of the bad behaviors was still kind of rearing up. So it was kind of a difficult time to try and comprehend everything that was going on, throw in things like the pandemic, throw things like, loss of jobs, throw things like the furlough, homeschooling. I mean, we were living through so much through that period to try and really digest everything, to think, well, what are we trying to fix and what are we going to prioritize? But we all knew that everything that was happening at that time was so important, and everything had to be addressed and had to, be looked at for us to move forward as a society. And if we move to the next slide. Again, there were a lot of things that, I saw and witnessed where, it felt as if people were trying to put a plaster on it in terms of dealing with the situation. There was a knee-jerk reaction of, we're going to run training, unconscious bias training, to say that we've delivered training, and then we can tick that box and move on and carry on. And there were those that were genuine and really wanted to do something about it and look at themselves, look at their organizations, look at how they were perceived from an external perspective. And it was really a reflective time for everybody. And if we move to that to the next slide, please, Peter. We could see that there was a lot of things that were happening. And I think amongst all that kind of, action and kind of what I kind of call sometimes a bit of a chaotic kind of time, as an organization, because of what we do and what we stand for as a social change organization. We were receiving a lot of calls from people saying, well, what's the right thing to do? What should we be doing? How can we move forward? How can we help our colleagues? How can we help our Black colleagues? How can we help, our colleagues that are currently having to deal with, reliving their lived experiences, some of which was quite traumatic. And it was a really, really tough time. But again, for us, it's the ones that really took the time to understand what the problems were, I think, are the ones that really started making an impactful difference and change in the organization, because they really took the time to stop, understand, look at the problem, look at what the issues were, where were these barriers, where were these inequalities, and what was the best way to kind of move forward. So it was really knowing that this was actually a journey that they would have to go on. It was a journey of change that wouldn't happen overnight, that wouldn't happen by, there was no silver bullet, that it was really about putting in the work. And it sometimes was a difficult kind of work, difficult conversations were being had, and people were being open and honest about their experiences and what they had been going through. And some of this might have come as new to people that were hearing it for the first time and didn't think it existed in their organizations. Some of this have been stuff that people knew, but it just turned a blind eye on, or things that they knew and had just kind of maybe put to the side and thought, we'll deal with that a bit later. Whereas, the moment had come where they had no other choice but to deal with it. And if we move to the next slide, please, Peter, you know, it made everyone look at things a little bit differently and look at the kind of society that we all want to live in, and you know, what would that look like? And again, you know, I remember speaking to some of our clients in the past around working from home. We would have people that would say, look, I really like the job, but it means I have to travel. It's a long way for me to travel. And you know, we would try and negotiate with the organizations around the location, the flexibility. And they were like, no, you know, we can't do it. All of a sudden, that working from home experience seemed to have worked. You know, we all found actually we can do this. We can actually work from home. And it was the first time, I think, that a lot of organizations started looking at the well-being and putting the well-being of the employees at the forefront, and really finding the right kind of you know, tools to be able to support them, you know, from a mental health perspective, from a well-being perspective. I think organizations started introducing new initiatives that they maybe had never done before, as a way to check in on the employees, as a way to look after each other, and just to make sure that everybody was okay. And it just meant it started to allow people to have some sort of a balance within their lives, being given that opportunity to work within the home function. You know, there was two sides of it, because there were people that obviously weren't full and had no other choice but, you know, to be at home. And in a way that kind of took away their kind of purpose, and how they, you know, the anxiety and anxiousness that came with not knowing whether they would have a job to go back to. And there were those that was then left over working and trying to make sure they kept everything going until their colleagues came back from furlough, that they actually had a business to come back to. You know, so there's a lot of, you know, things going on mentally that we all had to deal with, irrelevant of whether you were on furlough or you were not on furlough. You know, we all had challenges that we had to deal with. And, you know, having that support from employers, having that support from your colleagues meant so much. And, you know, normalizing the fact that people have families. You know, I for the first time, we could see our colleagues, you know, their children, their families, their dogs, their cats, all merging into one. You know, it's the first time we've ever had that. Whereas, you know, if I think previously, before you know, COVID, you know, people would have to try and sometimes be afraid to ask to have time off to go see their children in a school play, because that could have been taken a different way. All of a sudden, we were exposed to everybody's lives, we were exposed to everybody's living rooms, we were invited into their homes, invited into their lives in a way that we'd never been. And that started to become actually okay. You know, we started to drop the facade of, you know, how we wanted to be seen. And I remember the start of lockdown, everybody was kind of quite dressed up in the Zoom calls and Zoom meetings. As time went on, slowly, people started to shed some of that and just became comfortable with being themselves. And it was the first time in a long time that you could be having meetings, you know, with exec leaders who were in t-shirts, who were in sweatshirts, and that was actually okay. It was actually comforting. It was great to just see them as human beings. And I think it started to break down some of those barriers that we put on ourselves, that we put on society, and what we felt we had to kind of portray. And again, that started creating different initiatives from a D&I perspective, because organizations started to look at this and think, actually, we could be doing more now around supporting, you know, our parents and carers, because we can see the struggle that they have around things like homeschooling. Why don't we offer, you know, more times where people can work certain hours, they can flex their hours, whether they work, you know, a 40-hour week, but they can choose when those hours are, so that they have time to be able to manage and juggle all the different priorities that were now being forced upon us. And we all started changing as individuals, and how we interacted with each other, and how we looked after each other. And I remember speaking to clients around initiatives that they started introducing that they'd never thought of had this period not happened. And it really started to open our eyes in terms of what was important and what was not, and that the way that we lived and what priorities for us as individuals were. And really about the type of world that we now wanted to see, and the things that we wanted to keep about this world that we had been forced to be part of. And if we kind of move on to the next slide. it kind of forced us, as I said, to really think of what that word looks like. And I think we have an opportunity now as we start to think about, what it's going to be like moving out of this period. And I think it's, we slowly rebuilding as individuals, as organizations, as people, and relearning some of the things that we hold dear to us. And it's allowed us to really think of, when we do slowly move out, now that we know we have the date and when things are going to start returning, what kind of world do we want that to look like? What are the things that we've learned throughout this period that we want to make sure those lessons have been learned, and those lessons can be integrated into our everyday kind of lines? And what does that mean from a D&I perspective? Are we going to be able to support our colleagues from those different kind of backgrounds, whether that's parents and carers, whether that's people from different kind of backgrounds, whether that's people with mental health? We've learned to understand each other in a way that we probably never did before. And I think that's allowed us to really look at, well, what are the things that we need to be putting in place to make sure we don't lose some of those learnings, we don't lose some of those things that we now appreciate and know are so important into what we are as individuals and what we are as organizations. And I think now is that time. But again, it's about resetting some of these things that we know needed to be changed, and we know we can't go back to. And I think, there's a lot of people that don't want to go back to that old world. And sometimes when you talk about, the new normal, it's like, well, what is the new normal? What does that actually look like? And I think none of us really know, but I think there are things that we know we want to change, things that we know we want to do better at, things that we know we want to make sure we address. And as we move forward and come out of this lockdown, we come out of it as better citizens of the world. We come out as better employees, better employers, and just better people, to be able to stand up where we see the inequality, stand up where we see somebody's in trouble, stand up where we see somebody needs help, and all these things are great learnings that probably would not have happened had this period not been forced on us in the way that it was. And I think it's taught us a life lessons that we hope we have learned from, and we hope we take into this new world that we're moving into. And I'm just kind of conscious of time, because I know that I can see some questions starting to come through. I want to make sure that we have time to digest and kind of go through some of this information. So I'll move on to the next slide, if that's okay, Peter. But it just means, what does this mean for the future of organizations? What kind of organizations do we want to go back to? Looking at things like the flexible working from home. You've had organizations, the likes of, Spotify coming out and saying they're now giving the employees the choice of whether they want to work from home or whether they want to come into an office. These are now considerations that organizations are now having to say, right, when we do come out, what do we want that to look like from a work perspective? What are the key things that we want to make sure our employees come back to? And it's those kind of conversations, I think, that we're having now. But again, to not lose sight of some of the learnings that we've had during this period as well. And I think that is probably the time that I've got allocated to me. So I will open it up to some of the questions, if anybody's got anything that they want me to delve into a little bit deeper around some of the things that they feel might be beneficial for them or their organizations as we come out of this period.
Cynthia Davis, that was wonderful. Thank you very, very much. I've got questions, and so I'm going to launch into my questions in a minute, but I'm conscious of the Q&A as well. I'm just going to give you a very quick breather as I thank you formally at the end here, and we launch into questions, and also remind people of other events coming up. But I think you've packed in so much into that, and I'm conscious. I can see out the corner of my eye the Q&A box filling up, but I wouldn't mind asking you. My privilege. I don't usually do this. I wouldn't mind asking you a question. In that, I'm wondering whether we will see things now differently that we will then reflect in a year's time, and whether we all see it the same way. And I know you said there was differences, and some people have done well out of this, and there's been a leveling up as well. But I wonder whether there's an agreement of what it's like now, and whether there's any disagreements in your view, and also whether we will reflect in a year's time and think differently about what happened. I just thought that was what was intriguing me as you were talking. So if you want to answer that, you can do, but then I'll look into the other questions.
Yeah, and do you know what? And I think, we all have learned something throughout this period, and if I take that to a personal, from a personal perspective, one of the things that I've realized as a business owner is the ability for us to do more things to connect and look after our team, because everybody's been dealing with this very differently. There've been people that have been surrounded by families, there've been people that haven't been surrounded by families, that we've had to make sure we offer that kind of support, we reach out, we make sure everybody's okay. So it's allowed us to know our colleagues in a different way to maybe what we might have had on a day-to-day interaction, being in the office where people are coming in, they're getting on with the jobs, they're going back home. We would have never known some of their families, we would have never met them, their children, or been introduced to their pets or things like that. It's made us get to know the people that we interact with every day a little bit differently, and just make sure that those people are actually okay and looked after. I think the well-being for me has been the most important thing, because everybody has had to deal with something that was, dealt with this period very differently. Some people have coped so well, others haven't. People have had times where they've had things like Zoom fatigue and just thought, I just really don't want to be on another Zoom meeting. And that's actually okay. We should allow people the time to take the space off, or take the videos off, because they just can't look at the screens anymore. And I think it's allowing and learning that, sometimes people need different, different support in different ways and at different times, and that's okay. So I think for me, that's been the biggest learning, and that's something that we want to make sure as we come out of this, we still keep, whether we're in an environment where we're seeing each other every day, it's still checking in on each other every day. Even if we're seeing each other every day, asking some of those kind of questions. How's your kids? How's your cat? How's your dogs? The things that we got so used to seeing in a virtual world, we shouldn't lose some of that engagement. I think it's really, really important. I think that can only bring us closer as colleagues, and make us better, employers and employees.
A little comment from me. I think I'm now disappointed if I don't see somebody's cat or dog wandering across the screen.
I think I'm the same now, and it's just like, kids running in and out. It's been amazing to see that, and it's lovely to for people to actually just be. It's okay to see that. I think nobody's phased anymore. We've all accepted this is just the way we're living in now. That kids can come in and out and join in the fun. I think it's brilliant.
I'm now organised on the questions, so I'm now going to go through a sequence of questions that have come in, and many of you have realised you can upvote or like other people's questions, so you can push them up. I've selected one that came in very early, and so I'm going to ask that. I've highlighted it for those who can see all the questions, and it's quite a way down, but then I'll go back to what a lot of people are wanting to know about organizational type recommendations. But somebody was asking, would you say that the saying working at home is comfortable and we can do this is the privilege speaking, even though in the there's competitive requirements, and there's quotas on hiring, and there's a background of the labour workers who are either forced to stop or forced to go and work outside of that comfortable home. So do you think there's a privileged aspect to this, that the privileged have really won through?
Yeah, I mean, there is an element of, and I kind of look at this, that the people that have had to carry on working, during this pandemic, that didn't have the privilege of working from home, who are the frontline workers. I look at people that are every single day, our NHS, they're doing such an incredible job and they've got no choice. They can't work from home, and that's a privilege that the likes of me and you have, where we can still continue to work in a safe environment where we're not putting ourselves at risk, but other people haven't got that privilege. They have to go every single day, and this is why I think it's been so highlighted around the importance of the roles that people who sometimes are not seen as are not seen and viewed in the same way, now of suddenly getting the recognition that they deserve, and rightly so, because we would not be where we are today had it not been for all those key workers going out every single day whilst we worked from home, and they went every single day, whether that was in the supermarkets or the hospitals, or people that were providing care for our families when we couldn't be there to give them. So it is a privilege, and we have to look at ourselves, the fact that we have the ability to work from home, is a privilege that we can't take for granted, that not everyone's been afforded.
As promised, I'm now going to delve into much more specific to firms and organizations. I've highlighted the question right at the very top. It's asking for one recommendation, if that's possible, one recommendation to organizations who want to ensure that this isn't a short-lived focus on diversity and it actually becomes part of a long-term process of change. So is the one recommendation that you can come up with there?
And I use that word, there's no quick fix with this, right? And there's no, if there was, I think everybody would be doing it. And I think for me, it's putting in the work and just knowing that this is actually an ongoing journey. Nothing's going to change overnight, but understanding that there are changes to be made within your organization, and really knowing what those changes are, whether that's from an attraction point of view, a retention point of view, a progression point of view. It's knowing, well, where are those challenges and where are those barriers, and how do you fix those? And I think once you identify what the challenges or issues are, you're then able to look at what are the things that we need to do to try and fix it. If it's an attraction point of view and you're not attracting candidates from diverse kind of backgrounds, then you have to look at yourselves as an organization. What are you saying about yourselves that's maybe not resonating with people from different kind of backgrounds? Are they not seeing themselves represented within your organization? Therefore, they self-disqualify because they feel this isn't the organization for me, therefore I'm not going to even bother applying, and I'll self-disqualify. Or is it once people come into your organization and you finally attract them and they're working for you, it's an environment that doesn't allow them to succeed and to thrive because either the differences are held against them, or it's not an inclusive culture where they feel they can be their true authentic selves, and therefore they don't feel that sense of belonging and eventually leave, and then you lose them. Or is it the fact that people are coming in, they're giving their all to an organization but still can't progress, still can't break into some of those hierarchy kind of roles? And then that's something that you need to address and think of the pipeline in terms of your progression. What does that look like? Is it a fair process that you have? Is it allowing everyone an equal opportunity to progress? And how are you measuring that success for those that get promoted? So that's where you almost have to look at each stage and understand, well, where are the barriers, to then be able to understand, well, what do you actually need to do to address that? I don't think there's a one size fits all kind of approach to this either. Every organization is different and every organization is at a different stage of that journey. But the one thing I'd always say is understand where you are as an organization. Where is it that you're trying to get to? And then what are the steps that you need to take to get there? And that would be my piece of advice, that there is no quick fix, is the answer.
There's a follow-on question I've got for what I've just asked you, and that you started to bring out the following question I wanted to ask as well. So there's another question about how we able to prevent things going slowly back to pre-COVID, but the particular aspect of that question I wanted to focus on was that lack of flexibility. Just ignoring everything else, do you think that area of flexibility is going to change and we're going to lose that flexibility?
I certainly hope not, because I think it's proven that it can be done. So for all the doubters or people that kind of, were thinking, well, people can't work flexibly, and surely, are people actually working? We've now seen it can work. People have still been very productive. The organizations have still been working, and it works. I just think it's giving people that option, because this doesn't work for everybody. There are people that thrive from interacting with others, that actually like the ability to be within an office environment and see colleagues and interact with other people. And they're those that actually think, you know what, I actually prefer working in this environment because I have no distractions. I can just get on with it. So everybody's different. And I think it's having the ability to give people that choice. But there are roles where sometimes you have to be in an office. Then, if you have to be in an office and there is no other alternative and you can't change that, then that is the way that it is. But where you can make, some of those changes, at least, even if it's in part, so it doesn't have to be all the time, but give people that flexibility that they can maybe work two or 3 days from home. And then if they have meetings or they have to be in to interact with, with other kind of colleagues, then there's that option too. But I just think that belief of, working from home is never going to work, is never going to be productive. I think that's been shattered. I think people have proven that it can be done.
And now I want to go back to, you started talking before about taking stock, and I thought that was an excellent lead in to two questions. One at the very top of the list, which I'll ask first, but I'll make reference to one at the very bottom of the Q&A. And the one at the very top is the lack of BAME representation in leadership roles, and what can be institutionally done to change this. And there's a comment right at the very bottom about the recent Newsnight report on zero black senior managers within the FTSE 100. And you can either answer this one as the leadership angle, or the other as the lower paid roles, as in how, or both. How do you get more representation in the senior roles, and how do you stop that clustering in the lower paid grades?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I think it's something that we proactively challenging the status quo, because I think for me there's nothing worse than when I hear people saying that there's no talent, and especially black or Asian talent that's available to go into these roles, because that is one of the laziest excuses I've ever heard. It's because people aren't either working hard enough to find the talent. Is there, we just know it's not equal access to opportunities, and it's the way that people go out and seek that talent. We know sometimes it's not a level playing field. I think traditionally, if we look at how some of these roles have been appointed, it's because people tend to want comfort in people that either look like them, and therefore that's why you tend to have there's more, put it this way, there's more CEOs called John than they are women or people from an ethnic minority background. That's not a coincidence, but it's not the fact that the talent isn't there. I think it's about opening the gates wider. It's not about lowering the bar. It's about opening the gates wider to allow some of that talent to come through. But it's also recognizing that not everyone's been afforded the opportunities to be able to get to some of those top positions, because either they've never seen those opportunities, those opportunities being advertised at all, or if they are advertised, it's sometimes done in such a closed network that you only hear about them when somebody's been appointed into those roles. So it's not been a fair and open process, which has meant a lot of people have not had the opportunity to put themselves forward. And again, it's especially with the hierarchy, it's still, there's still a glass ceiling. And I know people talk about the glass ceiling when we talk about gender, but there's still a glass ceiling when we talk about ethnicity reaching to those top accolades. And it's not that the talent isn't there, it is there. And that's why I set up my business, to really try and challenge that status quo, to show that the people are there. You just need to give people access to those opportunities. Until we start opening up that access, then nothing will change. Until we start breaking down those networks that people tend to default to when they have these top jobs, and offer them for people that are part of those networks, therefore nothing will ever change. So we have to start running fairer processes that give everyone an equal and level playing field, but also equity in that process, because we don't want this to be either a tokenistic approach either, that people are just being hired because somebody wants to tick a diversity box and say, hey, look, we've hired Black people into these roles, it has to be a fair and open process. And it can't be setting people up to fail either. It's about giving people the ability that when they are in those top roles, you give them the ability to succeed and to thrive.
Interesting, because you talked a lot about enablers there, about how to enable things to happen. And I should have highlighted it. There's another question, a very long question.
Okay.
Both the person posing the question and I are apologizing for this long question. But the essence of that question, if I've understood it correctly, and I'll probably horribly summarize it, is all about barriers. So are the barriers creeping in that we don't realize they're barriers until they're implemented, and that there's going to be unintended consequences, and there might be other visible barriers that we know about now. And do you think there's things employers can do, or what is your advice for things that employers can do, not just to enable things to happen, but to take the barriers out, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I think sometimes, employers can, they have the power to make this change. And I think, don't be afraid to try different things. So I think there's a tendency that people keep doing the same kind of things and then expecting a different kind of outcome. So they will keep recruiting in the same kind of way, in the same kind of methods, in the, advertising the same kind of places and expecting the same kind of a different kind of result all of a sudden. It's like you have to think outside the box a little bit. You have to be a little bit innovative and remove some of the barriers around the way that your applications are done. So we've seen applications that sometimes are about like 12 pages long. So who's got time to fill in 12 pages of an application on top of a CV and a cover letter? That in itself is also a barrier. It's like, remove that. Is it necessary? What information do you actually need that you're not going to get from a CV? Maybe focus on that small bit that you actually need to capture that might not be on a CV, as opposed to making somebody go through 12 pages of an application form. So it's sometimes understanding some of the processes that you have in place around attracting talent and what could be deemed as a barrier, because again, what might not look as obvious as things like an application form could also be the biggest barrier that there is in terms of whether somebody has the time to sit through a 12-page application form before they submit a CV. But also the way when you run interview panels, I've seen this when I was back in the day, going for interviews. So I'd walk into a room for a job and I'd have the same sea of faces looking back at me, and there'll be 5-6 people all look the same, all dressed in the same kind of suits, and I'd be like, oh my God, I've got no chance here, because not one single, I'd almost be on the back foot a little bit. So it's understanding that if you are trying to run an inclusive process, make the environment inclusive as well, so people can feel a bit more comfortable walking into a room where they don't feel they're at a disadvantage, because what's facing them is kind of one dimension. And I think it's really about looking at it in a way that allows everyone to be their best selves. So try and remove some of those kind of barriers as well.
I'm realizing we're getting towards 5 o'clock, and as usual, we have too many questions. Cynthia, is it okay if we carry on until 5 and then I'll stop?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Perfect.
Good.
Fine.
Thank you very much. I was hoping you'd say yes.
My answers, so we get as many as we can between now and then.
There's so many questions, but I'm going to change the subject and I'm going to go a bit further down. And one's a trade union related, and one's a societal one. And I just wanted to try and move away from the employer, if that's okay, and explore some other areas. And I'm going to abuse these questions and make up my own on the back of them. But there's one question about the role of trade unions in setting up the right space and settings and the tone of the workplace. And there's another question about society. And I wondered whether in all what you said about employers, what can we say about the role of trade unions and what they can do and what society needs to do? So it's not just an employer focus, but there's wider activity and pressure.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of quite a tricky one to answer, because I mean, I don't know too much around trade unions, but from my understanding of trade unions, it's really, I suppose, putting their members at the heart of everything that they do, and trying to get the best outcomes for their members. and for me, you know, the members are signing up to the trade union because they want to have a voice that represents them. So it's really listening to what are the challenges that are coming, and what is something that seems to be consistent, a consistent challenge, or a consistent you know, kind of barrier that seems to be you know, coming from a lot of our kind of members. Clearly that's a priority of kind of focus. But you know, I think without knowing too much about trade unions, I don't want to make assumptions on what because it's not an area, to be honest, that I know too much about, and I'm not an expert and I've never really worked in a trade union environment, so I wouldn't really know too much and wouldn't want to say the wrong kind of thing. But that would be my understanding of, you know, what the trade unions are there to do, is to really support their members to you know, to get the best outcomes for them, whether that's from a work environment, or you know, a remuneration side, or benefit side as well. So
and if we take it even wider, so away from the firm and looking at society much more widely, are there things that could be done? I'm not going to frame this very well, but in society, rather than, you know, in everyday life, rather than surrounding the employer, that can either freeze the gains that we've got over the last year, or enhance them, that doesn't rely on the employer to lead it, but it can be pushed from wider society.
yeah, and I think, you know, the biggest thing I've kind of learned as a society is we all have the power to stand up, you know, and speak for those that don't have a voice. And I think if you see something that you don't feel is right, or you see somebody being treated in a way that you don't agree with, you know, as an individual, we should feel, you know, compelled to want to step in and say, hang on a minute, that's not right. And sometimes it's using you know, our voices, it's using our kind of privilege, it's using you know, what our knowledge to support those that might not be in a position to call out some of these behaviors. And a case being, you know, I had somebody that said they were in a supermarket, and somebody was having a go with this you know, checkout lady, and because she was kind of being quite slow, what they hadn't realized is, so she had a disability, and it wasn't a very obvious disability, and that's why she was being slow. And somebody obviously noticed that and went and actually, you know, had a word with this person that was being irate, and kind of, you know, and I think when they made them aware, they felt appalled and thought, oh, but it's the quick reaction that we sometimes come to as people, that we act before we stop and think. You know, I think it's sometimes as human beings, it's just taking an action where we stop and think about our actions and the impact that could have on somebody, on the people that are receiving that. And that goes on things like online. I mean, the amount of online abuse that is there at the moment is crazy, right? And it's being able to kind of call out some, you know, on social media, if you have a friend that says something that you don't agree with, don't just sit there and just ignore it. Maybe educate them a little bit, send them some links to read up, you know, and get them to kind of, you know, because unless we stand up and call things out, we sometimes, you know, we complacent, is it the word complacent, in some of these kind of actions, because we're not calling it out. So I think we all have the power to make a difference. We all have the power to stand up and speak out. And until we start doing that as individuals, our society will never change. Our society will never move forward. So it's about being a little bit braver as individuals, and just sometimes call things out where you can. Obviously do it in the right kind of way, so you don't get yourself in a situation either. But I just think it's just being about, you know, just being a little bit brave, and don't, you know, just walk away. You know, we all have a voice, and we can all use our voice for good.
Thank you. I'm going to naughtily squeeze in one last question, and it's at the very top of the Q&A, and I'm going to rephrase it very slightly. But is there any advice, if you're looking at an organization, what are the signs that organization is genuinely committed to diversity and inclusion? Can you detect from the outside?
I think obviously, because this is the world that I'm in, I now can spot the ones that are genuine, the ones that aren't. But I think for me, the ones that are genuine, the ones that, are very open about why they're doing it, the ones that I say, you know what, we've probably not got it right before, we know we want to change, and this is how we want to do it. We want you to be part of that change. And I think being honest and transparent, I think the more people are try and gloss over, the subject, that's when you can see some of the cracks starting to happen. And I think for me, that was evident when we saw, people are jumping out to put out statements after what happened with the BLM movement, but a lot of them got called out by the internal staff going, hang on a minute, you can't come out publicly and say you stand against racism. And yeah, we've got all these, discrimination cases ongoing in the organization. So I think sometimes it's just being open and honest. And I don't think anyone's expecting there to be a perfect organization, but I think the ones that are genuine about wanting to create an environment, that want people to come and help them create that environment, to make it better, to be part of those changes, and welcoming different voices and different perspectives, to me, those are the organizations that I think are probably more genuine, more likely to make more impactful and long-lasting kind of change. I think the ones that are looking for the quick fixes to just, be ticking a box, yeah, you tend to kind of spot the genuine ones. And it's about putting in the work. Like I said, nothing will change overnight, but it's just understanding that this is a journey, and it's sometimes a long journey that might be difficult, but nothing that's worth it is ever easy. So we have to be prepared to put in the work. We all have to be part of that solution, and organizations can't do this on their own. That's why sometimes it's important to have the employees also be part of that change, whether that's through employee resource groups or setting up internal kind of networks that can really help the organization to shape it, to be better. I think when you start looking at organizations, look at, do they have employee resource groups, and what do those resource groups do for for somebody like me? If I'm a parent, what support is there for parents? Do you have a parents kind of network? You're more likely to look and think, well, this is an organization that takes it seriously because this is what they've set up to help support parents in that organization. So that's where you can see action speaks louder than words in my case. So always look at what they're actually doing, go beyond the statements, look at the actual evidence of what they're doing to drive D&I change.
Wonderful. And I think that's a really happy sort of positive note of things to look at to end on. I want to ask more questions, but I'm not allowed because we've got to 5 o'clock. And it's just a privilege to have you here, Cynthia Davis. So
it's been such a privilege to be here, and thank you to everybody that has been listening in and that's joined in the session. I think it's hopefully people have taken something away that they can take into their organizations or into their everyday life, and how they interact with their friends or their colleagues, that might have been helpful from the talk today.